Hello, gorgeous ladies, and welcome to this month's training. We are focusing on the intersection between shadow work and dark feminine energy. Now, the two are not the same, but they intertwine in a really beautiful way. And in order to unlock your dark feminine energy, you need to really understand shadow work, what it is, how to utilize it, how to make the most of it, and why it's important in the first place. So, I'll talk first about the origins of shadow work, because anytime we see something that is really popularized, we want to get to the root of it to understand where it comes from, so that we make sure that the teachings that we are taking in are pure, so that we make sure that what we are learning is actually based on the original, rather than learning things from social media that maybe don't fully serve their purpose because they become too watered down. It becomes like Chinese whispers if we see the same thing over and over again. So, the origin of shadow work comes from one of the founding fathers of psychology. You've heard me speak about him before. So, it's Carl Jung. So, he believed that every psyche contains both the conscious self, which is it's like the persona that we present to the world, right? The personality that we are comfortable with the world seeing, and then the unconscious self, which is our shadow side. The shadow side is a side of ourselves that we tend to reject because it's quote unquote unacceptable, right? So our instincts, our more animalistic emotions and desires, the traits of ours that we have that we think maybe aren't good enough. And one thing that Jung really taught is what you resist will persist. So what that means is anything that you resist acknowledging, anything that you try not to acknowledge, anything that you try to pretend it doesn't exist in the first place, will start to act out through projection, through triggers, through repetitive patterns. So, for example, if you have trouble acknowledging, say, your bitchy side, right? All of us can be bitchy, and I actually had this issue for years. I had an incident where my stepfather called me, I think I spoke about this in the last training, but my stepfather called me a bitch. And so that word to me became so bad. That word to me became so dark and upset me so deeply that not even my husband was allowed to say it. So if he said it in an argument, I would get so intensely upset. Now, here's what's interesting, and neither of us are proud of this in our marriage, but early on in our marriage, if we got heated enough, he would tell me I was being a bitch, right? This isn't okay, but that's what would happen. It was only when I started to acknowledge that actually I do have a bitchy side because I'm a human being. Actually, there is part of me in arguments that can behave like a bitch. It was only when I actually did shadow work and chose to acknowledge why I resisted that word so much that all of a sudden, without me having said anything, he stopped using that word in arguments. What you resist will persist. The words that you don't want to label yourself with, the emotions, desires, traits that you don't want to acknowledge you actually have, will keep showing up in different ways that trigger you over and over again until you get to the point where you integrate, where you say, actually, this is part of me. And that's when the integration happens. So that's the essence of shadow work. When you do shadow work, you get to the point where other things and other people can't control you. When you're able to acknowledge that actually, as a human being, every trait in the world, every trait in the universe exists within you, it becomes very difficult to control you because you don't become resistant to different words. If somebody accuses you of something, you might sit back and think, oh, well, is that true? Let me contemplate that, rather than being triggered by the word and the label because we think it's bad. Here's what's interesting. They have done studies to show how Nazi Germany occurred in the first place. And what they came to find was that actually when you have multiple people doing the same thing at once, when you have your neighbors all thinking the same way, when you have a leader that becomes popular telling you to do certain acts, most people will do those acts. So it's easy to think that Nazi Germany was just full of evil, terrible people, but actually it was full of normal human beings that gave into herd mentality. Now, this has become slightly more difficult with social media. Now, some of us are harder to bamboozle than we might have used to be, but actually, in some ways, it's easier than ever before. It's a catch-22 with social media. We're at a point in history where if we are all told to think a certain way or to do a certain thing, it can take us a while to wake up and to think individually. And so all of us are capable of behaving like people from Nazi Germany. All of us are capable actually of behaving like a murderer would. All of us are capable of being homeless if we were born in different circumstances, in different times, maybe with a different knowledge set or different parents. All of us are capable of becoming the things that we abhor the most. And when you get to the point where you're able to acknowledge that and make peace with it, you stop being triggered by those specific things. So this takes us to dark feminine energy and where that intersection is. So the dark feminine is essentially a modern expression of the shadow concept in a lot of ways. So she's what happens when a woman welcomes the parts that she's thought for a long time are too much or too sexual or too ambitious or too emotional. It's the sides of femininity that are positive, but actually we tried to hide because we think they are wrong in some way. We're taught that they are wrong in some way. And what happens when a woman doesn't acknowledge the parts of her that already exist is we start to become a very watered down version of ourselves. This is why light feminine energy, which is things like your nurturing side, your playful side, your silly side, all of those things are beautiful. All of those things are entirely necessary. And also, if that's all that you embody as a woman, is the light feminine, and you don't fully acknowledge or integrate the parts of you that you think are quote unquote too much or too spicy or too ambitious or too emotional, the sides of you that have really deep desires, if you don't integrate those parts of you, then those parts are actually controlling you. And if you want to be the most impactful, incredible, generational changing version of yourself, you need to be able to integrate the dark feminine. Now, we'll touch on one thing first before we dive into anything else. And that's a question that I asked my mentor when I first learned about shadow work that is really important to answer. And that is, not every discomfort is shadow work, right? So if, for example, and this is something that I can get triggered by because it has to do with my values rather than a shadow. If I see somebody being rude to a receptionist, it's not something that I'm going to think about all day. It's not something that I'm going to sit there and stew on. But if I see it, it would give me the ick. I would find it unattractive if somebody else were doing that. If somebody else is rude to, staff when you go to eat at a restaurant, I find it really rude. I turn my nose up at that. I don't like it, right? Because it clashes with my values. So there is a such thing as you being triggered by something occurring without it actually being a shadow work trigger. So here's how you know when it's discomfort because you need to do some shadow work, because there's part of you that hasn't been integrated, there's part of you that you haven't acknowledged, versus you just witnessing like a mismatch in values and your body just not liking that. So a shadow work trigger, it feels like almost like a disproportionate reaction to the situation, right? So, for example, if I go back to the example with my husband, the few times that he called me a bitch in arguments, I flew off the handle. I got so upset. Now, again, still not an okay word for a man to call a woman, and bear in mind I've been married for a long time since we were very young. But my reaction was disproportionate. If he said that to me now, I would simply look him in the eyes and say, that's not an appropriate word to call me. And then I would walk away, right? And he would get the hint and he wouldn't do it again. But back then, I would fly off the handle. I would rant. I would rage. I'd be so upset. How dare you call me that word? You can't ever speak to me like that again. I should just get in the car and leave, etc. And that's because it was a shadow trigger versus a values clash, which is where you just feel this really grounded no. So again, if I see somebody being rude to somebody else needlessly, or because they think they're better, or because it seems like they think they're better, I'll just feel this calm no. It's not something that I stew on all day. It's not something that I feel like I need to fly off the handle over. It's just a no, I don't like that, right? A shadow work trigger is when you feel energy kind of looping in judgment, when you're really thinking about it a lot after the fact, right? So if, for example, you have, say, an incident with a partner or a colleague or a friend, and you are still bringing that thing up months later or years later, that would be a shadow trigger. That's something that you need to work on, because if you haven't been able to let it go after that much time, there's something internally that you need to work on. Versus a values clash where it feels like this really clean detachment where you just think that's not for me, right? A friend says something you don't like, that's not for me. I'm not going to pick that up. A partner says something that hurts, I'm walking away and removing my energy in this moment. That's it. It's a clean detachment rather than something that you feel yourself really looping on or obsessing over. A shadow trigger can also create projection. I'll touch on this in a second, but when there is a projection, that's a shadow work trigger, versus a values clash where there's just a really clear boundary without shame, right? So if you find yourself telling somebody else that they're doing something and they're so confused about what you're talking about, that could be a projection. Whereas when there is a values clash, you're able to just state a clear boundary without shame. There's not a huge amount of emotion attached to it. A shadow work trigger reveals that it's about you, right? When you think about it, when you do the inner work, you realize actually this is about me. Whereas a values clash, when you reflect on it, you confirm it's about them, right? So again, if I go back to the example of when people are rude to waiters in a restaurant, I acknowledge that I have it in me to be rude if I chose to, right? But I don't obsess about it. I don't loop about it. It's clearly just something that says more about somebody else than about me. I get upset when I see other people doing it, but I let it go. It's not something I'm thinking about past a few minutes later. I'll just kind of note it down as, if that person is rude to a waiter in a restaurant, is that somebody I really want in my life? Probably not, because it's a values clash. But it's not something I'm contemplating hours later. Once it happens, I note it down and I move on. So again, that's the difference between shadow work trigger and a values clash. So let's focus on what projection is, because this is a big part of shadow work. And it can be difficult. It's easy to see when other people are doing this. It's harder to see when we're doing this ourselves. But you will find that if there's a part of you that you haven't integrated, if there's part of you that you don't like to acknowledge exists, you might start telling other people that they have that issue. And if you notice you have a few people come to you in a row and say, look, I don't actually have that problem, that sounds like you, that's how you know that you're projecting. And also by asking yourself some very specific questions. So I'll give you some checking questions about this in a minute. But projection looks like if you secretly feel envious of somebody else, if you secretly feel like they're accomplishing more than you, or they're at a place in life that you'd actually like to be at, you might accuse them of being envious. Right? If you two have a disagreement, you might tell them, oh, seems like you're jealous, right? If you feel angry and you don't like acknowledging that you're angry, if you were taught that anger is wrong, that rage is wrong, that it's bad, if you were taught when you were younger to shove down your anger when it happened, if you weren't allowed to feel anger as a child, then you might accuse somebody else of having anger issues, right? You might yell at somebody else in the middle of an argument, you have anger issues, when they're calm as a cucumber and you're actually the one flying off the handle of it. That's how you know that it's a projection, because it's a part of you that you're not wanting to acknowledge. And so you're inadvertently, accidentally shoving it onto somebody else. Another example of a projection could be, and this is quite a common one that you can probably recognize in others quite easily, is if you have somebody who doesn't eat well and they're telling their kids to eat perfectly, or they're telling people around them to eat better, or they notice a lot when other people gain weight. I've seen this a lot in my husband's culture, where he's had family members that will sit around and watch. This is classic Eastern European culture. And I say this with love because I love my husband and his culture, but they'll sit around and watch tapes of weddings and they'll note down who's gained weight. But normally the people that are calling out who's gained weight are the ones that have actually gained weight the most since that wedding, right? So that would be a projection. It's much easier to talk about somebody else's weight gain or weight loss than it is to talk about your own. So that can also show up as if you have somebody in your life that maybe has gained weight or doesn't eat in a way that feels good for them. Maybe they're more tired. They've spoken a few times about how they want to lose weight. When you lose weight or get healthy, they might comment on it negatively. And that's a projection because actually they want what it is that you have. Right? So that's projection. Now for some journal prompts for you. And by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned this in this group before, but journaling makes such a huge difference. It does not have to be Dear Diary every day and writing 4 pages and mapping out your whole life in a book. It can be as simple as writing a few things that you're grateful for in the morning or at night, or a few contemplation questions, but especially if you are, and you likely are if you're in this group, if you're a woman who is passionate about her own self-development and her own growth, you will be getting prompts from me as your mentor. You'll be getting prompts from the group, maybe YouTube channels that you're watching or books that you're reading, and journal prompts are rampant at the moment. And so the way to prevent them from turning into overwhelm and actually utilize them properly is to actually journal on them, is to actually write them down. So with your actual journal in your hand, here are your journal prompts, and these will make such a huge difference in terms of shadow work. So number 1, who or what do I judge most harshly in others? Who or what do I judge most harshly in others? And if I secretly possess the same trait, how might it serve me or protect me? And for this, it's important to think about personality traits and how every positive personality trait has a negative. So if you are like me and you're a highly conscientious human being, you tend to be on time, you tend to like things just so, you tend to really like planning things out, the negative side of that might be that you can be uptight. Might be that maybe, and you've got to be okay with this word because this is part of shadow work, maybe you get a bit bitchy when people are late. Maybe you get really annoyed and frigid, there's a good word, if things don't go your way. I know I do. If I wake up on a Saturday morning and my husband changes plans, I do get very frigid. I get really upset. I don't like it. And so, but the positive side of that is I make things happen. I'm so conscientious. I organize things. I keep things just so. When we travel, I create such beautiful itineraries that we seamlessly do everything that we want to do because I organize us so well as a family, right? So for every positive trait, there's a negative. So back to that prompt, if I secretly possess the same trait, how might it serve me? So if what you judge in others is, say, the food that they eat, how might that serve you? If you were like that, if you ate without abandon, if you didn't care what you ate, how might that serve you? Well, maybe food would take up less headspace in your mind. Maybe you would try more things and not feel guilty about it. Maybe you would have a broader palate, right? So that's how the trait that you judge in others would serve you if you had that trait yourself. So that's how I want you to think about that prompt. All right, next one. Which emotions was I punished for or shamed for as a child? Which emotions was I punished or shamed for as a child? So it could be anger, jealousy, pride, sensuality is a huge one with many of my ladies that I work with. Which emotions were you punished for? Which character traits were you taught to shove down? And what might those emotions be trying to teach you about your power and boundaries now? Next one. What image of the good girl, the good woman, have I worked hard to maintain? What image of the good girl have I worked hard to maintain? Another way to think about that is, what does being a good girl mean to me? How do I try to embody it, right? What am I most afraid people would think if they saw the real me beneath the mask that I wear? Because all of us, no matter how much work you do, we wear a certain mask. There are parts of ourselves that we are ashamed of. There are parts of ourselves that we wish maybe didn't exist in us. And those parts often go against what being a good girl, quote unquote, means. So, what am I most afraid people would think of if they saw the real me? All right, next, and this is juicy. What part of me, if fully expressed, would make me feel dangerous, wild, or untamable? What part of me, if fully expressed, would make me feel dangerous, wild, or unattainable? What do I secretly crave that I publicly dismiss or mock in others? What do I secretly crave that I publicly dismiss or mock in others? And I'll tell you the two that I see come up most often in women. It's being high maintenance. So I see a lot of women mock others for being quote unquote high maintenance when actually they're sick of saying that they're low maintenance. Actually, they wish they were higher maintenance. They wish they would just allow themselves to be a bit harder to freaking maintain, right? Because being low maintenance can be its own kind of exhausting. Another one that I see come up for women is sexual freedom. And by that, I don't mean sleeping with a bunch of men, because that's not something that I advocate for, because actually that can become quite painful to us as human beings. Sex is an incredibly intimate act, and our bodies are precious and incredible, and we should be choosing very selectively who gets access to us, because sex is energy, and not everybody deserves our energy, right? We guard it the same way. But sexual freedom could look like the way that you flirt with your partner. It could look like wearing that really sexy dress on a date. It could look like cracking the sexual joke with a girlfriend and laughing with wild abandon at it, right? So sexual freedom can mean many different things. And so that's something that we as women are often taught to mock in others, when actually secretly we crave it amongst ourselves. All right, and last one for you. Who has triggered me lately? Who has triggered me lately? In part 2 of this question, if I were to admit that I carry a piece of what I see in them, what would it be? If I were to admit that I carry a piece of what I see in them, what would it be? All right, ladies, that's a lot to journal on. That's a lot to start integrating. So I'll let you go away and do that. Any questions that you have about this, go ahead and drop it in the group. Shadow work can feel so mysterious when you first start doing it. And I've been dropping small bits and pieces of shadow work in this group already. So the exercise that I've had you do before to help with perfectionism, where I have you name different aspects of yourself, give it a name and befriend it, that's actually shadow work. The dark feminine energy work that we've done in here before is actually shadow work. But unless it's called that and you're really diving into it, it can be hard to recognize. And also, shadow work is sticky. Shadow work is difficult. Shadow work is something so deep and so psychological that many people never do it. And it can be, because the very nature of shadow work is to face your triggers, it will be triggering. It will feel sticky. It will feel like wading through molasses when you're first doing it. And quite frankly, the whole time you're doing it, it's always hard. But afterwards, the aftermath is practically orgasmic. The aftermath is incredible. So do the journal prompts, and any questions that you have, anything that feels sticky you're not sure about, come back and drop it in the group.